The chimney access panel in the west corridor was ajar. It should have been sealed. I stopped, hand on my rifle sling, listening. From inside the flue came a thin sound, almost lost to the draft. Not an alarm, not a voice meant to be heard. Protocol said continue patrol. Instinct said wait. The sound came again, closer, and the corridor felt suddenly narrow. The guard stopped with one boot still half raised, the polished toe hovering above the runner carpet. The West Service corridor was cool compared to the rest of the floor, a subtle temperature difference caused by the exterior wall and the vertical shafts running behind it. He had walked this route hundreds of times. The rhythm of it lived in his muscles. That was how he noticed the panel. The chimney access door sat a hand's width open, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to break the line of the stonework. He lowered his foot and stood still. The corridor lighting hummed faintly, fluorescent tubes hidden behind frosted panels. No one else was present. No footsteps. No voices. The palace at this hour held itself in controlled quiet, staff movement reduced, most residents behind secured doors. He approached without urgency, posture unchanged. Drawing attention to small things created problems of its own. The panel should have been sealed with a tamper tag, thin wire looped through a numbered lead crimp. The wire hung loose, cut cleanly. No tear, no fray. Someone had taken the time. He did not touch it immediately. Instead, he scanned the corridor intersections at either end, then glanced at the ceiling cameras. The nearest dome lens was pointed correctly, its indicator light steady. No obvious interference. That, too, was notable. He keyed his radio once, then stopped himself. No immediate threat, no confirmed breach. Escalation required cause. He knelt and leaned closer. The air moving from the narrow opening carried a faint mineral smell, cold stone and dust. Chimney shafts were dead spaces now, most long sealed, repurposed for ventilation or simply left hollow. They were not on any active access route. A sound reached him then, so slight he questioned it. A thin disturbance in the airflow, irregular, not mechanical. He waited, counting his breath. It came again, softer this time, a tremor rather than a noise. He straightened slowly and stepped back, positioning himself so his body shielded the panel from the nearest camera's angle. His gloved hand rested near his radio, not pressing the transmit. Protocol ran through his mind with practiced clarity. Any irregularity was to be logged. Any suspected breach escalated through command. Unauthorized opening of structural access panels fell under facilities management unless evidence suggested otherwise. There was no evidence yet, only absence of the seal of explanation. He removed the small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote briefly and precisely. Time, location, condition, no interpretation. He tore the page free, folded it, and placed it inside the temporary incident sleeve clipped to his belt. Isolation came next. He moved to the corridor junction and placed the discreet magnetic barrier across the staff passage, its matte finish blending into the wall trim. Another at the opposite end. To anyone approaching, the message would be subtle but firm. Do not pass. He returned to the panel and crouched again. This time, he brought his ear closer, ignoring the grit that pressed through the fabric of his uniform trousers. He held still long enough that the silence became heavy. Then it happened. A small sound unmistakably human now, short, uncontrolled, abruptly cut off as if suppressed by fear or exhaustion. The guard's jaw tightened. He did not move for several seconds. Somewhere above, deep within the stonework, something or someone had shifted. He reached for the radio and paused. Once he spoke, the situation would no longer belong to him. Command would take over, procedures would follow, time would stretch. He looked at the open panel again, at the clean-cut wire, at the dark beyond. The sound did not repeat. He kept his finger off the transmit and listened. The radio remained silent against his chest. He shifted his weight and pressed 2 fingers lightly against the stone beside the opening, feeling for vibration. The wall was cold, steady. Whatever had made the sound was not moving now. He straightened and took one measured step back, giving himself a full view of the corridor again. No alarms, no footsteps. The palace continued as if nothing had changed. That more than anything unsettled him. Breaches were usually loud, arguments, mistakes, hurried cover stories. This one had the quiet of planning. He keyed the radio halfway, enough to wake the circuit but not transmit. His thumb hovered. He pictured the response chain: duty sergeant, control room, facilities supervisor. Questions would come immediately. Why now? What proof? Had he touched anything? The panel would be resealed before anyone if authority over living quarters was notified. That was how minor irregularities were resolved. He released the button. Instead, he adjusted his stance and spoke softly into the dark opening, not forming words, just letting sound exist. Nothing answered. He waited again, longer this time, until the silence pressed against his ears. Then, faint and unmistakable, a breath caught somewhere deep inside the shaft. A small intake, sharp with effort. The guard felt it more than he heard it, a disturbance in the air that did not belong to stone or draft. He acted. The panel was heavier than it looked. He lifted it carefully, supporting its weight so it would not scrape. Behind it, the shaft descended at a slight angle before dropping vertically, brickwork old and uneven. A maintenance ladder had once been fixed there. Only rusted anchors remained. He did not shine his torch yet. Light could startle, could cause movement. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to the minimum required to carry. "It's all right," he said quietly without projection. Not a command, not reassurance. A statement of presence. For a moment nothing happened. Then a sound closer, now clearer. A small, involuntary sob immediately smothered. The guard's shoulders tightened. There was no doubt left. He reached for the radio and transmitted on the secure channel, voice controlled, stripped of emotion. "Control, this is West Corridor Post 3. I have a confirmed irregularity escalating to welfare concern. Structural access breach. Possible juvenile present. I am holding position." The response came quickly, clipped, clarified juvenile. Child-sized breathing and vocalization within Chimney shaft. No visual yet. A pause, not long but deliberate. "Stand by. Do not proceed further without authorization." "Understood," he said, though his hands were already moving. He switched channels and sent a coded alert reserved for immediate protective concerns, one that bypassed facilities and logged directly with Palace Security Command. It was not protocol for unconfirmed situations. He accepted the mark it would leave on his record. The torch came on, beam narrowed, angled upward. Pale brick dust, a scrape of fabric caught on mortar. Higher still, small fingers, white with strain, gripping a ledge that should not have existed. "Stay where you are," he said, still quiet. "I can see you." The fingers tightened. A face did not appear, but the breathing quickened. Footsteps approached at the far end of the corridor. The guard shifted, placing himself between the shaft and the sound, one hand raised in a subtle halt as another uniformed figure rounded the corner. "Restricted," he said calmly. "Control is aware." The other guard hesitated, reading his posture, the open panel, the light disappearing into the wall. Understanding dawned without comment. He nodded once and stepped back, taking up a position at the barrier. The radio crackled again. "Post 3, command is en route. Maintain. No extraction until assessment." The guard looked back into the shaft. Dust drifted slowly through the torch beam. The small hands trembled. He did not acknowledge the order aloud. Instead, he shifted his stance, bracing himself against the stone, calculating distances, weight, angles. He adjusted the torch so the light rested steady, not blinding. "Hold on," he said, barely louder than a breath. The guard remained braced against the wall, One shoulder pressed into the cold stone as command voices began to layer over the radio. He listened without responding, filtering tone rather than words. There was no panic. That was good. There was also hesitation. That was expected. Dust drifted slowly from the shaft, disturbed by the faint, uneven movement inside. The child's breathing came in short bursts now, controlled badly, as if she had learned that sound itself could be dangerous. The guard adjusted the torch again, narrowing the beam so it rested on the brick just below her hands, giving light without forcing her into it. Stone carried sound in strange ways. He knew that. Old palaces amplified whispers and swallowed shouts. What reached him now was not crying, not fully. It was restraint, that more than fear told him how long she might have been there. He shifted his feet, widening his stance. The chimney interior angled inward, forcing anyone inside to brace themselves unnaturally. Muscles would tire, fingers would slip. Time was already working against her. "Control," he said quietly, keeping his voice neutral. "She's conscious. Grip is weakening." Another pause, longer this time. "Understood," came the reply. "Structural team is 5 minutes out. Medical is standing by." 5 minutes could be nothing, or it could be everything. He glanced once toward the far end of the corridor. 2 additional guards had arrived, forming a silent perimeter. No one spoke. No one asked questions. They followed the stillness he set, mirroring his restraint. Inside the shaft, the breathing hitched again. A small foot scraped against brick, dislodging grit that pattered softly down the flue. The guard raised his free hand instinctively, as if he could steady the wall itself. "It's all right," he said again, the same words, the same tone. Consistency mattered. "Don't move unless you need to." The child did not answer. She did not need to. Her fingers shifted, one slipping slightly before catching again. The guard noted it, committing the image to memory with professional precision. If she fell, it would not be far, but far enough. His radio clicked. A different voice this time, higher authority, controlled, measured, unused to uncertainty. "Confirm identity," the voice said. The guard kept his eyes on the shaft. Negative visual confirmation, but location and context indicate a protected minor. Silence followed, not dead air, deliberation. "This area was cleared," the voice said finally. "No scheduled access, no record of." "Records are incomplete," the guard interrupted, just enough to matter. "The panel seal was cut cleanly. This wasn't an accident." Another pause. He could almost hear the calculation happening elsewhere, behind desks and screens, far from the cold wall pressing into his shoulder. Inside the shaft, the child made a small sound at last. Not a word, not a cry. A single, involuntary whimper, quickly swallowed. The guard felt something tighten in his chest, but his posture did not change. "Control," he said, lowering his voice further as if proximity alone demanded it. "She's tiring. If we wait for structural, we may lose her grip." The response was not immediate. He shifted his hand closer to the edge of the opening, fingers curling around stone worn smooth by centuries of smoke and heat. He tested the edge subtly. It held. From somewhere deeper in the palace, faint movement echoed, doors opening, hurried but restrained. Authority was moving now. Slowly, carefully. The child's fingers slipped again, this time more noticeably. She caught herself, but the effort cost her. Her breathing grew sharper, closer to panic. The guard made his decision internally, without ceremony. He adjusted his stance one final time, setting his weight, measuring reach and risk. He did not announce it. He leaned closer to the opening and extended his arm into the shaft. The stone scraped lightly against his sleeve as he reached in, careful not to disturb the brickwork. The shaft narrowed just beyond the opening, forcing his arm at an awkward angle. He tested the space inch by inch, feeling the cold resistance of masonry, the faint tremor of air moving past. "Take my hand," he said quietly, the words shaped slowly so they would travel without echo. Just your hand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one small hand loosened from the ledge and reached downward, searching. Her fingers brushed his glove once, missed, then found it again. They were cold. He closed his grip gently but firmly, enough to be felt, not enough to pull yet. He held there, letting the contact settle. Her breathing stuttered, then slowed just slightly. "I've got you," he said, still calm, still even. Behind him, boots shifted. Someone murmured into a radio, voice kept low. The guard did not look back. His focus narrowed to the weight in his hand, the tension in his forearm, the angle of her wrist. He began to draw her closer, millimeter by millimeter. The brick resisted, the shaft narrowing again before widening. Dust fell into his eyes. He ignored it. Her grip tightened, nails pressing through the glove. She did not cry out. Halfway, her foot slipped. The sudden drop of her weight pulled hard against his shoulder. He braced instinctively, pressing his back into the opposite wall, using the corridor itself as leverage. Stone met bone with a dull impact. Pain flared, then dulled. He did not release her. "Easy," he said once, steadying both of them. "You're all right." Her other hand appeared now, grasping blindly until it found his sleeve. Together, he guided her upward, adjusting his grip as her shoulders cleared the narrowest point. The movement was slow, deliberate, dictated by the limits of the space rather than urgency. When her head emerged into the corridor light, he angled the torch away immediately. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, overwhelmed by the sudden brightness. Soot streaked her face. Her hair was tangled, caught with dust and fragments of mortar. She was shaking, not violently but continuously, as if the cold had settled into her bones. He supported her weight as she came free, lowering her carefully to the floor. She did not stand. She folded inward instead, knees drawn slightly, hands clenched against her chest. He positioned himself between her and the corridor, creating a barrier without blocking air or light. A medic moved in quietly, kneeling opposite him. No rush, no sudden gestures. The guard did not relinquish his position until the medic met his eyes and nodded once. "She's stable," the medic said softly. "Why dehydrated? Shock." The guard acknowledged with a slight dip of his head. Only then did he shift aside, remaining close but no longer central. Command arrived moments later, shoes too clean for patrol, voices carefully modulated, questions framed as confirmations rather than accusations. The guard answered briefly, factually, panel condition, sound, extraction. No one asked why he had acted without authorization. Not yet. The child was wrapped in a thermal blanket and lifted gently onto a stretcher. As they moved her, she reached out once, fingers brushing his sleeve again. Not gripping this time, just contact. He stilled until her hand withdrew. When they passed beyond the barrier, the corridor felt larger, emptier. The open panel gaped darkly, its purpose revealed but not explained. The guard looked at it for a long moment. What had begun as a sound had become proof. Stone carried more than echoes. It carried responsibility. He keyed his radio again, voice level. "Post 3, extraction complete." The reply came immediately. "Acknowledged, stand by for further instruction." He remained where he was, back against the wall, eyes on the shadowed shaft. The questions would come later. For now, the palace held its breath. The corridor did not return to normal once the stretcher passed. Sound crept back in slowly, as if the palace itself were uncertain what was permitted now. A distant door closed. Somewhere above, a ventilation fan adjusted pitch. The guard remained at post 3, shoulders squared, eyes forward, while the perimeter loosened and reformed into something less discreet and more official. Two figures approached from the eastern junction, not guards on rotation. Their pace was measured, unhurried, shoes quiet against stone. One wore the dark suit of Palace Security Command. The other carried a tablet under his arm, facilities insignia stitched neatly at the collar. Authority, layered rather than singular. The guard straightened a fraction more. He did not salute. This was not that moment. "Give us a minute," the security officer said to the remaining guards. His tone was neutral, practiced. The corridor cleared without comment. The officer stopped a step short of the open panel and looked at it for several seconds before speaking. He did not touch it. "You logged this as an irregularity," he said. "Yes," the guard replied. "And escalated before confirmation." "I escalated when confirmation was audible." The facility's representative shifted his weight, eyes flicking briefly toward the shaft. "There was no work order for this access," he said. "None scheduled, none pending." The guard nodded once. The seal was cut cleanly. The officer's gaze moved to him then, assessing, not hostile but not aligned either. "You understand why that matters?" "I do." The officer exhaled slowly through his nose. "You also understand that unauthorized extraction inside a load-bearing structure carries risk." "Yes." "Yet you proceeded." The guard did not answer immediately. He looked at the panel, at the dark space beyond where the child had been. The absence felt heavier now than her presence had. "She was losing her grip," he said finally. Silence followed, not disagreement, consideration. The facility's representative cleared his throat. "This section of the chimney hasn't been inspected in years," he said. "It was sealed during the last refurbishment cycle. Access should have been impossible without tools." "Someone had tools," the guard said. The officer glanced at the tablet. "We're still determining how far this goes." The word "how" carried weight. It implied systems, permissions, people. A radio crackled softly at the officer's shoulder. He turned away slightly, listening, then nodded once to himself. When he faced the guard again, his expression had shifted, tightened just perceptibly. "The child is confirmed," he said. "Identity verified." The guard felt the confirmation land without visible reaction. It did not change what had happened. It only raised the cost. "Her father is being informed," the officer continued, "separately." The facility's representative stiffened. "That escalates this beyond." "It already is," the officer said, cutting in smoothly. "We're past facilities." He turned back to the guard. "Until further notice, this corridor is sealed. You will remain available for statement." "Yes, sir." The officer hesitated, then added, "You did the right thing." The words were quiet, almost procedural. They did not feel like absolution, more like acknowledgement that rules had limits. As they moved away, the guard exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders only slightly. He knew better than to relax fully. Statements became records. Records became narratives. Narratives were shaped by those who never stood in cold corridors listening for breath through stone. He glanced once more at the shaft. Somewhere inside, dust still settled. Evidence waited in silence. Down the corridor hurried foots. PS approached again, this time lighter, civilian, purposeful. The guard turned as a familiar figure rounded the corner. Tie loosened, posture tight with restrained urgency. Eyes fixed not on the panel but beyond it, toward where the stretcher had gone. Authority was changing hands. Prince William did not slow when he saw the guard. He did not ask permission to enter the corridor or wait for briefing. His stride was controlled but purposeful, the kind that came from long practice at keeping urgency contained. Two aides trailed behind him, already adjusting to his pace, one speaking quietly into a phone, the other watching the walls as if the palace itself might shift. The guard stepped aside just enough to clear the path, then repositioned himself instinctively, maintaining proximity without obstruction. He did not salute. The moment did not permit ceremony. William stopped several paces from the open panel. He did not approach it immediately. His gaze moved instead to the scuffed stone where the guard's shoulder had struck, to the faint trail of dust across the floor, to the thermal blanket corner left behind when the stretcher turned. Where was she? He asked. The guard answered without preamble. Inside the shaft, approximately 2 meters up, wedged at the narrowing. William closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his focus sharpened. How long? Unknown, the guard said, but long enough to learn not to make noise. That landed harder than any accusation. William's jaw tightened. He took one step closer to the panel now, peering into the darkness without flinching. Who cleared this corridor? He asked, not to anyone in particular. No one answered immediately. The aides exchanged a look. The facility's representative, now returned and visibly uncomfortable, adjusted his grip on the tablet. There was a signed clearance, he said carefully. Earlier this afternoon, routine inspection authorization. William turned his head slowly. Signed by whom? The man hesitated, just a fraction, enough. That will be addressed, the security officer said quickly, stepping in. Right now the priority is. My daughter, William said quietly, not raised, not sharp, just precise, is already the priority. He turned back to the guard. You heard her. Yes, sir. And you acted. Yes. William nodded once, a small movement decisive. Thank you. The words were simple. They did not absolve protocol breaches or erase reports, but they shifted the balance in the corridor. Authority, once abstract, had become personal. I want this space documented, William continued. Every access point, every log, no internal handling. The security officer hesitated. That will require. I am aware of what it requires, William said. Proceed. The guard watched the exchange without comment. This was the wall breaking, not physically yet, but administratively. Barriers built of procedure and deference giving way under direct insistence. A radio call came through the officer's earpiece. He listened, then nodded. Medical confirms she's stable. She's asking for you. William's shoulders lowered slightly, tension releasing in a controlled measure. He turned to leave, then paused. He looked at the guard again. You stayed with her. I maintained position, the guard said. William's gaze held for a second longer. That matters. When he left, the corridor felt altered, as if the stone itself had registered the shift. Orders began to move faster now. Cameras were checked. Logs pulled. The open panel was no longer just an irregularity. It was a breach with consequence. The guard remained at post 3, answering questions as they came, his earlier decision echoing outward into systems far beyond the chimney wall. Protocol would reassert itself soon. Investigations always did, but something irreversible had already occurred. A sound had been heard, and someone had listened. The corridor was no longer quiet. It had become busy in the restrained way only controlled institutions managed. Voices low, movements deliberate, urgency filtered through discipline. The open panel was photographed, measured, logged. No one closed it yet. Not anymore. The guard stood slightly apart now, no longer central but still essential. He watched others move through the space he had just occupied alone. The shaft that had demanded his attention was being treated as evidence, not a place where a child had waited in the dark. A senior structural engineer arrived, gray-haired, calm, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being trusted. He examined the opening without touching it, eyes tracing the brickwork, the cut wire, the stress marks near the anchors. This wasn't forced in a hurry, the engineer said. The seal was removed properly, tools were used. The panel was opened and closed more than once. More than once, the security officer repeated. Yes, the engineer replied. Dust patterns don't lie. The guard noted the phrase, pa. T-turns mattered. They were harder to dismiss than instincts. A temporary command post was established at the corridor junction. Screens were brought in. Live feeds replayed silently. Timestamps scrolled backward. The guard watched as his own earlier patrol passed across a monitor, unaware of what would follow. Nothing appeared out of place. That absence was now the problem. The officer approached him again. "We're reconstructing access," he said. "Your actions initiated this. Walk me through your decision." The guard spoke evenly. He described the panel, the sound, the delay. He did not justify himself. He did not editorialize. He stopped when the sequence ended. "You understood you were exceeding standing orders," the officer said. "Yes." "And you accepted the consequence." "Yes." The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That will be noted." Nearby, the facility's representative was speaking quietly into his phone, face tight. The guard watched him from the corner of his eye. The man's discomfort was not guilt exactly. It was recognition of systems failing under scrutiny. A new instruction came down. All chimney shafts in the west wing were to be checked immediately. Not sealed, checked. The distinction mattered. As teams moved out, the guard felt a familiar pressure return. The moment of crisis had passed. Now came process. Process had a way of smoothing sharp edges, of turning decisions into data points. He was asked to stand by while internal access permissions were reviewed. Names appeared on screens, digital signatures, time-limited clearances issued under broad authority. Nothing overtly illegal, nothing obviously malicious, just enough ambiguity to create cover. The guard's attention returned to the open panel. He stepped closer again, studying the stone with new eyes. The interior bore faint marks now visible under stronger light, scratches, scuffs, a smudge of fabric caught on a protruding brick. Evidence of movement, of effort. Someone had known exactly how far a child could be lowered before panic set in, how sound would carry, how long before anyone noticed. The realization settled without drama. This had not been reckless, it had been calculated. The guard felt the weight of that knowledge press down more heavily than any reprimand could have. He understood now why escalation had been resisted earlier. Not out of incompetence, out of fear of implication. The officer's radio crackled again. He listened, then looked up. "Command wants you," he said, privately. The guard nodded once and followed, leaving the open panel behind. The corridor swallowed the sound of their footsteps as they moved away from the shaft. Behind them, the chimney waited, silent, documented, no longer ignored. The temporary command room had been set up in what was once a small portrait gallery, its walls lined with faces that watched without comment. Screens glowed where paintings had been partially covered, cables running carefully along the floor to avoid tripping hazards. The room smelled faintly of dust and warm electronics. The guard was positioned near the entrance, not seated. He remained standing by instinct, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward. The security officer entered a moment later, closing the door softly behind him. "This isn't disciplinary," the officer said. "Not yet." The guard acknowledged without speaking. "We're trying to determine how far up this goes," the officer continued. "That requires honesty, not loyalty, not assumption." "I understand." The officer gestured to a screen. Footage from earlier in the day played silently. A service worker appeared, uniform unremarkable, badge scanned at a restricted access point. Time stamped mid-afternoon. The image froze. "Do you recognize him?" "No." "Neither does facilities," the officer said. "Badge was valid, issued, logged, no irregular flags." He changed the feed. Another angle, same man, different corridor. The chimney access panel visible in the background, still sealed at that point. "He had authorization to be there," the officer said, "but not to do what he did." The guard watched the screen. The man moved with confidence, no hesitation. He knew the building, knew its blind spots. "What happens to me?" the guard asked. The officer looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "Because someone will need a procedural fault," the guard said, "and I exceeded protocol." The officer considered this. "You created a record," he said finally. "That matters. Without it, this would have been closed as a facilities error." The guard nodded once. "There will be questions," the officer continued, "about why you waited, why you acted, why you didn't escalate sooner. I can answer those." "I know," the officer said, "but others may not like the answers." A message appeared on the officer's device. He read it, then looked up. "The child has been moved to a secure medical suite," he said. "Limited access, family only." The guard absorbed that silently. She asked, "D about the man in red," the officer added. The guard's posture did not change, but something in his expression tightened briefly, then settled. "She won't be seeing you," the officer said. "That's not how this works." "I know." The officer sighed quietly. "You did your job, just not the way it's written." He opened the door again. The gallery beyond felt cooler, the light dimmer. As they walked back toward the west wing, the guard became aware of how tired he was, not physically, but in the way sustained attention drained the body. The adrenaline had burned off. What remained was clarity. They stopped near the corridor where it had begun. The panel was now sealed again, marked, monitored, official. The guard took his post nearby, eyes scanning, listening as he always had. The palace resumed its controlled rhythm around him. But something had shifted. Authority had been tested. Instinct had overridden instruction. A child had been found where no child should ever have been. And the guard knew with certainty that the story was not finished. The medical suite was several corridors away, sealed behind layers of access control that changed as one moved inward. The guard did not accompany the transfer. He remained where he was assigned, but his awareness followed the route instinctively, mapping distance and time without conscious effort, knowing where someone was mattered, even when you were not meant to see them. His post overlooked a junction that funneled movement from staff-only passages into the residential wing. The lighting here was warmer, deliberately softened. The palace curated calm the way it curated history. He stood within it, immobile, while the systems around him worked. Updates came sparingly over the radio. Stable vitals. No immediate injuries. Observation required. Each message was brief, professional, stripped of detail. That was intentional. Children, especially royal ones, generated gravity. Too much information attracted attention. He adjusted his stance as a senior medic passed through the junction, face composed, pace steady. No urgency now. The worst moment had already happened. Inside the suite, the child lay wrapped in layered blankets, her small frame barely raising them. The room was kept slightly warmer than the rest of the wing. Temperature stabilized. Light dimmed. Sound controlled. Machines hummed softly, calibrated not to startle. She did not speak much. When she did, it was in fragments, single words, requests for water, questions that were not finished. The staff responded carefully, never rushing answers, never offering more than was asked. When she slept, it was shallow. Her hands clenched and unclenched without purpose. The medic noted it, adjusted the blanket, documented the response. Outside, the guard listened. He had been reassigned closer to the suite now, not inside, but near enough that any change in movement would pass through his awareness first. This was deliberate. Familiarity mattered in protection. He had been the first constant she had encountered when the stone opened. The system recognized that, even if it would never state it aloud. A consultant from Child Services arrived quietly, credentials verified twice. She moved with practiced restraint, voice low, eyes observant. She spoke to the medical lead in the antechamber, never looking directly toward the suite door while discussing what lay behind it. "She may not remember everything," the consultant said, "but her body will." The guard absorbed the sentence as it passed him, unacknowledged. He understood its meaning without interpretation. The chimney had not been just a space. It had been confinement. The consultant entered the suite alone. The door closed softly behind her. Minutes passed, then more. From where he stood, the guard could hear nothing. That, too, was intentional. Privacy was another layer of protection. Still, he remained alert, noting every shift of air, every footstep beyond the door. A different sound reached him eventually. Not crying, not speech. A small, irregular rhythm, breathing that did not quite settle, then slowed as another presence adjusted to it. The consultant emerged later, face composed, expression unreadable. She spoke briefly to the medic, then turned and walked away without looking back. The medical lead approached the guard's position. "She's calm," he said quietly, "as much as can be expected." The guard nodded once. "She asked if the wall was still there," the medic added. The guard did not respond immediately. "What did you tell her?" "That it was," the medic said, "but that it couldn't hurt her anymore." The guard returned his gaze to the corridor. Stone walls, clean lines, no openings. Some barriers, he knew, were not removed. They were simply made safe enough to live beside. Night settled unevenly over the palace. The lighting dimmed in stages, corridors slipping into softer shadows as schedules shifted and movement thinned. The guard remained at his post near. The medical suite, posture unchanged, senses recalibrated to the quieter hours. At night, sound carried differently. Footsteps announced themselves sooner. Doors seemed louder, more final. Inside the suite, the child slept again. This time longer. Her breathing found a steadier rhythm, shallow but even. A monitor traced small rises and falls without urgency. The medical staff rotated quietly, each handover conducted in murmurs, details exchanged with precision. No one lingered unnecessarily. Prince William arrived without entourage. No aides, no phones, just a jacket pulled on hastily over formal clothes, tie absent. He paused outside the suite, one hand resting briefly against the doorframe, as if grounding himself before entering. The guard noted the gesture without looking directly at him. William nodded once to the medical lead, received a brief update, then stepped inside. The door closed behind him, sealing off the space again. The guard shifted his stance slightly, widening his field of awareness. This was a different kind of protection now, not against intrusion but against interruption. Time passed. When William emerged, it was slower. His movements lacked the tight urgency from earlier. His face carried fatigue rather than anger. He stopped a short distance from the guard, not quite addressing him, not quite ignoring him either. "She's sleeping," he said. "Yes, sir." William looked down the corridor, then back toward the closed door. "They say she kept very still," he said, more to the space than to the guard. "Didn't call out." The guard chose his words carefully. She was trying not to be heard. William nodded once. The statement required no elaboration. "There will be questions," William said. "Public ones, internal ones. They won't all be asked by people who understand what matters." "I understand," the guard replied. William studied him for a moment. "You followed your instinct." "Yes." "And it conflicted with protocol." "Yes." William exhaled slowly. Sometimes the structure protects itself before it protects the people inside it. The guard did not respond. Agreement was not his role. Observation was. William stepped back, preparing to leave. Then he paused. "She asked about you again," he said. "Not by name, by description." The guard felt the words settle, quiet and heavy. She was disoriented. "Still," William said, "she remembered." He left then, footsteps fading down the corridor, swallowed by distance and carpet. The night deepened. Sometime near morning, the consultant returned briefly, accompanied by a senior investigator from Palace Security. They spoke in the antechamber, voices low, careful. Terms like environmental manipulation and access exploitation surfaced, clinical phrases designed to contain something that resisted containment. The guard listened without appearing to. When the investigator approached him, it was with a measured nod. "You'll be requested for formal testimony," he said. "Not today." "Yes, and for what it's worth," the investigator added, "your restraint mattered as much as your action." The guard acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head. As dawn approached, light crept back into the corridors, pale and indirect. The palace shifted again, preparing to present itself as unchanged. Walls remained intact, doors closed properly, logs reconciled. But the guard knew better. He had heard a child through stone. He had felt the limits of authority press against responsibility. And somewhere behind the sealed door, a young girl slept, safe for now, carrying the memory of darkness and the knowledge that someone had listened. He remained at his post as the day began, alert, silent, and waiting for what would come next. Morning brought clarity without comfort. The palace woke into routine with deliberate care, as if normality could be restored by repetition alone. Staff returned to corridors that had been sealed hours earlier. Doors opened on schedule. Briefings resumed. The building presented itself as intact. The guard remained assigned near the west wing, though his post had shifted again, closer to the structural spine of the palace now, where stone was thickest and corridors narrowed. He understood the placement. This was where the questions would concentrate. Engineers arrived first. Not maintenance, but assessment. Helmets under arms, instruments carried carefully, voices low. They moved through the space around the chimney shaft with professional detachment, marking points on diagrams, tapping stone with gloved knuckles, listening for hollow response. The wall itself became the focus. The engineer who had examined the panel earlier stood with Prince William near the sealed opening. The guard observed from a measured distance, eyes tracking posture and movement rather than words. William's stance was rigid, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed on the stone as if it might speak. "This section was never meant to be accessed internally," the engineer said, breaking through Carey's risk. William did not look at him. Risk to whom? "To the structure," the engineer replied, "and to anyone nearby." William turned then, slowly. "My daughter was inside that structure." The engineer inclined his head. "Yes, sir." "What I'm asking," William continued, "is whether it can be done safely." The engineer paused, considering. "Yes," he said finally, "but not quietly." That was the moment the guard felt the shift. The language had changed, from whether to how. Orders followed quickly after that, cascading downward with unusual speed. Access permissions were overridden. Structural authority superseded aesthetic preservation. The palace, long resistant to alteration, prepared to be opened. The guard was instructed to reposition closer to the breach site, not as a barrier now, but as a witness. His presence was intentional. Decisions made here would be reviewed later, dissected. Someone needed to remember how it had felt before the wall came down. Equipment was brought in discreetly, tools designed to cut stone without shock, to manage dust, to control collapse. The corridor was cleared again, this time completely. Silence returned, heavier than before. William stood back as the first markings were made on the wall. Chalk lines traced clean shapes over ancient brick. The guard watched the contrast, temporary white against permanent gray. "Proceed," William said. The sound was controlled but unmistakable. Stone yielded reluctantly, vibration traveling through the floor and into the guard's boots. He adjusted his stance, absorbing it through bent knees, eyes fixed on the fracture line. Dust rose, fine and pale, catching the light. The smell of old masonry filled the corridor, dry and metallic. With each cut, the wall surrendered more of its secrecy. Behind it, darkness waited. The engineer raised a hand. The tools stopped. A small opening had been created, just enough to see inside. The guard leaned forward slightly, unbidden, drawn by habit. The space beyond was revealed, scratched brick, disturbed dust, a shallow ledge worn by pressure. Evidence made visible not through investigation but through force. William stepped closer, peering into the opening. His expression did not change, but his breathing did. The guard recognized the moment for what it was. Protocol had not failed, it had been exceeded. And the wall, once unquestioned, was no longer absolute. The opening widened incrementally, each section of stone removed with care and catalogued before being set aside. The palace did not allow destruction without documentation. Even now, restraint governed motion. As the cavity opened, the internal geometry of the chimney revealed itself fully. The narrowing that had trapped the child was visible now, its dimensions precise, unforgiving. Marks scarred the brick where small shoes had pressed repeatedly, seeking leverage. A faint smear traced the ledge where her hands had held. The guard felt the weight of it settle in his chest. What had been imagined was now exact. The engineer leaned in, torch angled low. She was placed, he said quietly, not dropped. William closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his gaze hardened, not with anger but with focus. Then someone knew this space. Yes, the engineer replied, and knew how long it would take before she was found. That sentence echoed in the corridor, unanswered. The guard noticed William's hands clench once behind his back, then relax. He did not speak. He did not need to. Authority had already shifted from inquiry to action. Document everything, William said. I want a full reconstruction. The security officer nodded. We're pulling access logs across all wings. Maintenance, contractors, temporary staff. No exclusions. William turned slightly, his attention finally settling on the guard. Their eyes met briefly. There was no gratitude in the exchange now, only recognition of shared responsibility. You heard her before anyone else, William said. That will matter. The guard acknowledged with a single nod. As the work concluded, the breach stood open, an intentional wound in the palace wall. It would be sealed again eventually, reinforced, restored to invisibility. But for now it remained exposed, proof that silence could be broken when pressure was applied correctly. The corridor cleared slowly. Engineers packed away tools. Security maintained the perimeter. The guard remained at his position, eyes tracing the now visible interior, committing details to memory. He knew these images would surface later, unbidden. When William finally stepped away, he did so without ceremony, leaving orders in his wake that rippled outward through departments and hierarchies. Investigations accelerated. Protocols were suspended. Accountability was no longer theoretical. The palace adjusted. The guard felt it in subtle ways. The quickened pace of footsteps, the sharper tone in radio exchanges, the absence of routine complacency. Systems that had relied on assumption were being forced to justify themselves. He remained still amid the movement. The wall had been broken, not just physically but symbolically. It marked a point beyond which quiet deferral was no longer possible. And the guard understood that what came next would not be loud. It would be precise. It would be personal. And it would arrive soon. The palace entered a different phase after the wall was opened. Not urgency, intent. Movement became deliberate in a way that suggested preparation rather than reaction. Offices that rarely coordinated began exchanging information directly. Clearances were suspended and reissued. Access that had once depended on trust now required verification. The guard felt the change immediately. He was reassigned again, this time to a position near the administrative core, where decisions were logged and reviewed rather than acted upon. The corridor here was narrower, lined with offices rather than rooms of ceremony. The air was warmer, less forgiving. Conversations carried more easily. Investigators moved in pairs, not uniforms but tailored restraint. They spoke softly, often stopping mid-sentence when passing him, then resuming once distance was regained. He listened without appearing to. Patterns mattered more than content. Names surfaced repeatedly. Not senior ones, not junior ones either. Mid-level authority, people who signed off without visibility, who relied on process to insulate them from consequence. The guard was called in for statement late morning. The room was plain. No portraits, no windows, just a table, two chairs, a recorder placed carefully between them. The investigator gestured for him to sit. He did not. "Your preference," the investigator said. The questions were precise. Times, distances, decisions. Why he paused before transmitting. Why he shielded the panel from camera view. Why he escalated through a channel not designated for structural anomalies. He answered each without elaboration. "I paused to listen," he said. "I shielded the panel to prevent premature closure. I escalated when the risk exceeded the scope of facility's response." The investigator nodded, recording. No challenge, no approval. "Do you believe," the investigator asked, "that someone intended for the child to remain undiscovered for a specific period of time?" The guard considered this carefully. Belief was not evidence, but observation was. "Yes," he said, "based on placement, sound suppression, and access control." Silence followed. The investigator wrote something down. Outside the room, activity continued. A senior facilities manager was escorted past the door later, face pale, posture stiff. Not arrested, not dismissed, just removed from circulation. The guard returned to his post afterward, unchanged in appearance but altered in placement. He now stood at a junction where corridors converged from private offices and secure archives. This was where consequences traveled before being finalized. He observed as a sealed document was transferred under escort. As a phone call ended abruptly, voice sharp despite attempts at calm. As a familiar security officer avoided his gaze for the first time. Authority was no longer abstract, it was defensive. Late in the afternoon, the security officer approached him again. His tone was lower than before. "The narrative is forming," he said. "There will be findings, recommendations, structural changes." "And responsibility," the guard said. "Yes," the officer replied, "but not evenly distributed." The guard understood. Systems absorbed shock by redirecting it. Rarely did they allow full collapse. "She's being moved tomorrow," the officer added, "out of the palace temporarily." "For safety," the guard said. "For control," the officer corrected gently. The guard returned his gaze to the corridor. The palace was still, too still. That kind of quiet followed exposure. He knew now that listening had been the easy part. What followed, holding the line while others decided how much truth could survive, would be harder. The transfer took place before dawn, not announced, not observed by more than a handful of people whose presence was required rather than requested. The guard was not assigned to the escort, but he was positioned where the route passed briefly through his sector. He recognized the timing for what it was, an effort to reduce variables. The vehicle stopped only long enough for doors to open and close. The child was carried, not walking, wrapped in a coat far too large for her, head resting against her father's shoulder. Her face was turned inward, away from light, away from the building that had contained her fear. She did not look up as she passed. The guard remained still. He did not watch them leave. He watched the space they left behind. Once the transfer cleared the grounds, the palace exhaled. Schedules resumed. Staff returned to normal entry points. The administrative corps began the work of converting disruption into reportable outcome. By midday, the first removals were formalized. A facilities coordinator placed on indefinite leave. A contractor's access revoked pending inquiry. No public statements. No explanations beyond procedural review. The guard read none of this directly. He inferred it from absence, doors that no longer opened, names that disappeared from rotation lists. silence where routine chatter had once filled corridors. In the afternoon, he was summoned again, this time not for questioning but acknowledgement. The same security officer met him outside a conference room, expression neutral. "Your conduct has been reviewed," he said. "No breach will be recorded." The guard absorbed the words without reaction. "There will be a note," the officer continued, commending discretion under pressure. "A note," the guard repeated. "Yes." "And the cause," the guard asked, "will that be recorded?" The officer hesitated, just long enough. "There will be findings," he said carefully. "They will not be simple." The guard nodded once. Complexity was often how truth was softened. As the day drew toward evening, the guard returned to his original patrol route. The west corridor was open again, its stone seamless, the access panel restored and sealed with a new tag. The wall bore no visible scar. Only someone who knew where to look would sense the difference. He paused briefly where it had begun. The palace was quiet, but it was not the same quiet. It was alert now, self-aware in a way it had not been before. Systems adjusted, oversight tightened. Fear had entered places where complacency once lived. The guard resumed his patrol. He did not expect recognition. He did not expect resolution. Protection was not about endings. It was about intervening at the moment when silence became dangerous. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a child was safe because someone had listened. And somewhere within the palace, systems had learned, uneasily, that authority without attention could be broken by a sound no one was meant to hear. The guard walked on, posture steady, senses open, prepared to notice the next irregularity. Because that was the duty. And because listening, he knew now, was never passive. Time settled back into the palace cautiously, as if unsure it was welcome. The days that followed were orderly on the surface. Briefings held, patrols rotated, routines reasserted. But beneath that structure ran a quieter current of adjustment. People moved with slightly more awareness. Doors were checked twice. Logs were read instead of assumed. The guard noticed these things, because noticing was his work. He had returned fully to standard rotation now, no longer positioned near the West Wing or the administrative core. The system had reabsorbed him. That, too, was intentional. Visibility invited interpretation. Normality discouraged it. Yet the palace did not forget entirely. He passed through corridors where conversation stopped half a beat too late. He received nods from staff who had never acknowledged him before. Nothing overt, nothing improper, just recognition that he had stood at the point where something could have been ignored and was not. The child did not return. That absence was quietly managed. Her rooms were secured, then repurposed temporarily for maintenance. Toys were removed discreetly. No announcement was made. To the outside world, nothing had happened. To those inside, the silence was specific. One evening, near the end of his shift, the guard was redirected briefly to cover a private passage while another unit rotated through. The assignment was unremarkable. The passage connected offices rarely used after hours. Still, he noted the change. As he stood there, footsteps approached, measured, familiar. Prince William emerged from the adjoining corridor alone, jacket folded over one arm. He slowed when he saw the guard, then stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. "They've finalized the internal findings," William said eventually. "Yes, sir." "There will be consequences," William continued. "Quiet ones, careers end quietly here." The guard listened without response. "She's doing well," William added. "She doesn't talk about the wall, not directly." The guard nodded once. "But she listens more now," William said, "to everything." That was not an observation meant for record. It lingered in the space between them. William shifted his weight, then straightened. "You won't hear from us again about this," he said. "That's deliberate." "I understand." William held his gaze for a second longer. then inclined his head, not formally but deliberately. He turned and continued down the passage, footsteps receding until the corridor reclaimed its quiet. The guard remained at his post. Later that night, as the palace settled fully into darkness, he resumed his patrol along the outer corridors. The stone walls felt unchanged beneath his gloved hand, solid, impassive, yet he knew now how easily silence could hid. Intent. He slowed at intervals, listening, not for alarms, not for movement, but for irregularity, a sound that did not belong, an absence where something should have been. Protection, he understood, was not about force. It was about attention sustained over time, about resisting the pressure to look away when nothing was supposed to be wrong. The palace would continue, it always did. And the guard would walk its corridors, alert to the smallest deviation, prepared to pause when others passed through without hearing. Because somewhere once, a child had been heard through stone. And that had been enough. The weeks that followed settled into something resembling resolution, though the guard knew better than to call it that. Palaces did not resolve, they absorbed. He noticed how procedures subtly changed. Maintenance teams now required secondary verification in zones once governed by trust alone. Access panels were reclassified, no longer dismissed as inert infrastructure. New inspection schedules appeared without explanation, folded quietly into routine. The building was learning, slowly, reluctantly. So were the people inside it. The guard's name appeared once in an internal memo he was not meant to see, glimpsed briefly on a screen left unattended. Not praised, not highlighted, simply referenced as initial reporting officer. That was enough. Records mattered more than recognition. He continued his patrols as before. Same routes, same measured pace, same discipline of attention. Yet he found that he listened differently now, not more intensely but with greater patience. Silence no longer implied safety. It required confirmation. One afternoon, during a routine inspection cycle, he paused at a corridor he rarely worked. Nothing was wrong with it. That was the problem. The air felt stagnant, undisturbed for too long. He checked the logs later. They were complete, perfectly so. He flagged the corridor for review anyway. No child was found, no breach uncovered. The report closed quietly. Still, the act itself mattered. The system registered resistance to complacency. Near the end of the season, word reached him indirectly that the child had returned briefly to the grounds. Only the gardens, only for an hour, surrounded by open sky. She had not gone near the west wing. No one suggested that she should. He imagined her moving cautiously, listening to gravel beneath her shoes, reassured by sound rather than frightened by it. The thought passed without sentiment, recorded and set aside. On his final patrol of the week, he walked the length of the palace exterior, stone lit softly against the night. The walls were high, unbroken, ancient. They had endured countless events that never entered record. This one had, barely. He stopped once, resting his gloved hand against the stone, feeling the cold seep through. Solid, impenetrable, and yet he knew now what it could conceal. The guard moved on. He would never speak of the chimney. He would never describe the sound or the weight of a small hand gripping his glove. Those details were not meant for sharing. They belonged to the quiet ledger of duty fulfilled without witness. What remained was vigilance. The palace slept behind him, confident again in its strength. The guard walked its perimeter, alert to the smallest deviation, prepared to pause when others would continue. Because protection was not an act performed once. It was a discipline. And somewhere beyond the walls, a child was safe. Not because the palace had held, but because someone had listened when stone was supposed to be silent.